Hey, Sean.
Hey, Dr. Albert.
And hey, everyone. Sean and I decided to do a little chat, a little conversation about a topic that both of us see in our sessions very often. And hoping through this conversation to give a bit of insight and some ideas and practices for you that is hopefully useful for you to use. And the topic that we decided on is anxiety. So there's two headlines that we'd like to cover. The first one is just how we understand anxiety, how it tends to show up, the definition, and then a little bit around the work of anxiety, what we do. And then maybe there'll be a third piece this conversation evolves into. Anything else from you, Sean, before we kick off?
No, that sounds pretty good. I think having maybe some practices at the end would be a good idea.
Yeah,
Yeah,
actually, like feeling into doing it together. Oh, that'd be good.
exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So I'll kick us off. The reason I wanted to have this conversation is often people come into session with the topic of anxiety, and I sometimes feel that the word anxiety is problematic. One, because it tends to be a bit of a diagnosis, a label. Like we think I have anxiety as if it's a condition. Two, because anxiety tends to be seen as a negative thing or something that we need to get rid of it, and we can't really. And three, I tend to come up with three things. And three, because people tend to get stuck on that thing, on anxiety, and it's almost like it distracts us from what we can actually work with. It's really hard to work with a concept like anxiety. It's much easier to work with just what the actual experience is.
Yes.
Does that resonate for you? What's
Yeah,
your
I'll,
take?
I'll bolt on to the third one with being, what do we do about it? What about that experience do we do about it? Because if we have that concept, that idea, that definition, like you mentioned, it's really hard to put something into practice. It's a
Mm,
concept, it's theory. It's like, how do I actually deal with this thing? Like a basic thing I'll say now is like when I see people in my coaching practice, there's a whole other physiological or sensory cluster of phenomenon going on in the coaching room. Yeah. So how do we deal with that? It's, oh, I feel tense when I'm anxious. You can't talk your way out of tension. The
mm.
concept, knowing what anxiety is, knowing that concept is that unfortunately, just knowing the concept, like, oh, I have anxiety. Okay, that's great. That's the first step.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what anxious energy feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like
Yeah.
the word anxious energy because that's also why initially when I started coaching, I felt labeling emotions is useful. And I still think it's useful, but it's really an introduction. It's not, it opens the door. It doesn't actually do anything yet.
Mm.
Nowadays, what I find a little bit more practical is to think about emotions more in terms of the experience and the energy, like the word you used. And so what I tend to do for myself, and you know this, we do this in our dynamic as well. It's easier to talk from the experience of what's going on for me in terms of activation. So instead of talking about anxious or stressed or sad, I'm noticing I'm activated, which means my energy is going up
Yeah.
and it's feeling maybe unpleasant. And unpleasant activated can be anger, anxiety, stress, can be a lot of different things, but it feels less judgy. Like I'm not saying it's anxiety and it's this thing. And it gives a
Mm.
bit more room for the blurred lines between experiences. Because sometimes I might be stressed about something that's real. Other times I might be stressed because of some fear in my head. And that's a very different experience. But
Yeah.
but the physiological feeling of higher energy, slightly tense, that might be similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, does that?
Yeah. Yeah. Because, yeah, let's maybe break that down. Anxious energy. It's,
Yeah.
we know the concept cognitively in our conscious mind. We read it on a page, right? But now we're
Mm.
feeling something maybe in the body, or when we're getting the anxious energy coming up or it's becoming stirred, our thoughts actually start to change. We might actually lose grip of, oh, this is the definition of it. Now I'm feeling something else. So I'm thinking
Mm.
something else.
Do you have an example of that with when you work
Yeah.
with clients in that way?
So what happens is, let's just break it down a little bit more simply, is that when a client's talking about something they're deeply concerned about, or what they're frustrated about, or their partner's done X, right? That then stirs up the stress response in the body. So our brain is now in an active, heightened state, this active physiological heightened state is now happening, right? We feel the heat, the tension in the body. We might start to move and get a bit more jittery. There's something attached to this emotional experience for you that is now creating more stress response in your body. And depending on who we are and our development, we might respond differently. You not doing something at home might trigger me more than me not doing something at home for you. Or that thing happens at work with the boss. One person is severely affected by it, but another person is just, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. So that depends on who we are as well. The intensity of the physiology kicking off inside you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what that's essentially doing is it's telling our system that there's something threatening happening. Threatening is, we can define that, but it doesn't feel comfortable. So that age-old biological system is now gearing us up to either defend, to fight, to move away, to shut down. And our body actually needs energy to do that. So the physiology is just coming up and happening, right? The conscious mind knows why it's happening in terms of what's happening through the definition of it or the interaction on the outside. But our body just still seems to be getting the stress response. It doesn't know the difference yet, right?
Yeah.
It just knows that this is a problem.
But isn't that also where you think people get stuck? Is that the mind makes sense of it, and then it's
Yes.
almost like the mind, at least in my experience, it's like we ignore the experience. We're like, oh, it's anxiety, and then we get fixated on this idea instead of tuning into the continual, the tension and the energy that's still running in the organism, and finding a way to go into
Yeah.
it. Is that
That's the gap. That's the problem. So we could still go home, and that thing that I described that could be annoying us, we could be sitting watching Netflix and just wanting to chill out. Like we consciously know we're relaxing now. But still, that thought, that thing that hasn't been resolved, is still burning away. So the stress response kicks in again, and it kicks in again. As soon as that thought comes into your mind, that text message comes, that thing that happened at work, your partner still hasn't done X, it's
it
still
runs in the
gonna
background.
it's gonna run in the background. Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time, dumping that stress, that anxious energy into your body because it wants you to either do one of those options I said before. The most important thing in the safest world we live in now, not safe for everyone, but is that it'll keep happening unless we complete it.
So just to check, for you, part of the work in working with this state, whatever we label it, is to find a sense of completion. Is that part of
Exactly.
the aim of the coaching work, is to complete certain processes?
Yeah. So the stress response isn't always activated. This physiology of stress isn't always being turned on. And we go through 4 stages, like we've spoken now, the awareness stage, the insight of what it is, and the intensity, the actual physiological experience. And then this part we all struggle with is the containment. Can I actually be with this uncomfortable thing? Can I now actually stay in relationship with my partner and actually get this thing resolved so I can move to completion?
So meaning, just to check, so in order to get, I guess it depends on the situation, but most of the time, in order to get to the other side of whatever this feeling is, whether it's stress or anxiety or maybe even anger, the aim is to you need to, in a sense, be in that emotional state, working through the thing.
Yeah.
You can't just try and soothe the feeling away.
No.
And I think that's often what I think the challenge is in working with this. So just to also bring it back to the structure. So the definition is a challenge. And so taking a bit of the labels out and talking about energy. And then I try to encourage people to tune into, one thing I often say is, you can't think yourself out of anxiety. You can't think yourself out of any state, really, because you can't. It's a physiological response. And then we'd ask, what practices do you do to support you with stress or anxiety? And people would usually say, I exercise, or sometimes I meditate if I remember, or I do breathing practices, or I go to yoga or whatever, and it tends to be physical practices, but they tend to refer to it as something they do and it helps. But
Yeah.
it's so difficult, in my experience, to help people connect to that is the door. It's like the body
Exactly.
is the door in. And so how do you help your clients or anyone to, in a way, stop running to the mind and the ideas and just go through the door of the body? Because that's the only
Yeah.
way in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So talk coaching, and not only talk coaching, but other types of therapy, might only stay in the awareness stage.
Mm.
We bring it into the intensity stage, and that's actually staying with the
The
physiological sense,
physiology.
experience. So what does it feel like? Where is the tension? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because when you ask that question about what do you do when you get into that state, this is my story as well, because I didn't know how to deal with my anxious energy and the stress response and the emotions I was experiencing, was that I was aware of it and I felt the intensity, but it drove me to exercise excessively. So I jumped to completion. I
Mm.
want to skip intensity and skip containment and really understand why my emotional experience was doing this or why it was happening.
Yeah.
So we can go to yoga, we can go to all these other things, but then we still haven't had the completion would look like having a conversation with your partner, getting the
Mm.
result, having the conversation with your boss.
Yeah.
But the coaching experience would stay in that segment of intensity and containment because I didn't actually have capacity to deal with the rush of the chemistry and the burning, and it just drove me to do something else, just to work it out.
Mm.
Yeah. So then I was actually numbing out rather than processing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's very common.
Yeah. And then when we actually dip into that physiology, we stay with the experience, we know what it's like, it becomes more familiar.
Mm.
And then slowly, because it becomes more familiar, and you're like, oh, it's not so bad. I had that session with Shaun or Albert, and now the containment, your capacity starts to expand. It's like you're training a muscle. To
Mm.
get good at anxiety, to be better and more resilient with anxiety, is we actually have to go into the anxiety gym.
Yeah, I think this feels like such a critical part of the understanding is it's
Yeah.
not about, because the approach and the popular, what people want and what we all want is to feel better. So we
Feel better.
want to heal anxiety, fix anxiety, de-stress, calm
Yeah.
down, but we should actually get better at anxiety, get better at getting angry. And it's interesting, right? Because one of the most common requests we get in from organizations for manager training and for staff training is difficult conversations.
Mm.
But what people want is they want to have a difficult conversation without it being difficult. It's a bit of I want to sit there and chat and it should be easy. I'm like, then it's not a difficult conversation. You need to have the
Yeah.
emotional muscle to have a
Yeah.
difficult conversation. It's like saying I want to lift 50 kilograms without actually feeling it. You have to feel it, otherwise you're not really lifting.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we always want to, that's why we get the awareness, we jump to completion, whatever strategy
Yeah.
that. And also, let's not dismiss all those practices that wish it away,
Yeah.
regulate. I saw this one thing for yoga. It was like yoga all your shit away. That was the marketing title. And I was like, okay, so that's calming everything down. That's what we'll also do in a coaching process. Yeah, we use tools for regulation for sure. But once you're in that state that's a little bit more pliable, then we actually do the work. So if
Mm.
someone was really anxious, I'm not going to start the session with, okay, let's work with the anxiety and make them more anxious.
Yeah, yeah. It's a bit like warming up before going for a run. You want the body to
Exactly.
be ready to do a bit of exertion. And at the same instance, I think what we miss, and I know I miss it in my practice because I sometimes follow the client's desire, which is, can we just make it, I just want life to be easier. Life is hard enough. But yes, we want it to be easier, but then we need to be stronger because life is hard.
Yeah,
And
we
if we're
need,
stronger, yeah, it becomes easier, but it's not, we can't just make it easy, as in take the discomfort away.
no, because that's not life then. If,
Yeah, you're not able to face real challenges then.
yeah, if we actually really dig down into the physiology, like if we didn't have that stress response, if we didn't have that anxious energy, one, it's for
Mm.
survival energy. Yeah. If it is indeed a necessary moment to fight for survival, but now it's just in a very different context
Mm,
in the modern world. So we feel that and that's why we have those strategies that is wish it away, yoga it away, whatever it is, regulate, because it doesn't fit the context of the world right now. It's not useful
mm,
for us to be productive. We want to have this conversation, we want productivity, but we don't want to feel terrible in the tough conversation. We just want
mm,
our managers to be communicating better. But we actually have to come back to acknowledging, wow, this is us. This is our biology. It's quite amazing that it's allowing us to have a certain sense of alertness or aliveness. We don't ever have stress or the physiological response, even your heart beating. Those vessels around the heart have been taking on small amounts of stress of the force of the blood coming out of that amazing muscle. So if we don't have that stress, we wouldn't be alive.
Yeah, yeah. The stress is actually, and in a sense, and I feel that ties in nicely with, on the one hand, not labeling it as a bad thing as anxiety, but just as energy, and then seeing the usefulness and the vitality of the energy, and feeling something that I've seen in studies as well, is that the physiological experience of anxiety and excitement is pretty much the same. Your hormones and everything happens, but the way that you're framing it makes it feel negative or unpleasant or pleasant and exciting, and you have that sense of the vibrating vitality in your organism.
Exactly. Yeah.
And maybe to bring it down to a few practicalities then, the one part of it in my mind, and to see if there's something missing, is to pay attention to the regulation, because I think it's important for us to recognize, one, you can't think your way out of it. So what do you do to make it more bearable? So it's not like high level anxiety, maybe cooling it down. That's the one part. But I also wonder, what is the mechanism to get better at anxiety, to almost lean in, to do your reps, to build that capacity? Do you have some practices you use?
Yeah. So the first thing I would suggest is to not run away from it.
Hmm.
When it's happening, yeah, even in the moment, you're going to feel something in your body, in your mind, even if it's here.
Hmm.
Put your hand on that area and just maybe turn around and say hello this time. Like being with has such a huge power, because if we again turn away, that thing is calling us to our physiology. It creates more tension. That gap,
Hmm.
and it actually adds more stress. But you'll be surprised. I had one client and I said to her, she mentioned this and this happening, and now I'm feeling it. I can see everything. I could see her skin color change. And all I said is, what we're going to do today is befriend your anxiety.
Hmm.
She turned around and actually fate came into it, and things started to soften. So if you give yourself
Hmm.
a moment of pause and you really just, oh, maybe I am anxious.
Yeah, and I guess this is maybe where the coaching becomes quite important, because I know from my own therapy that some of the emotions, my organism doesn't even register. It's like it locks it away, so I don't feel that feeling. I'm just like numb.
Yeah.
But when the therapist is there, I feel a bit safer with them to actually go into it. It's like you have someone's hand when you go into the cold water and you go deeply, like, ah. And so I
Yeah.
think that's actually what one role of the coach and the therapist that people don't necessarily know is not to make things better, but to help you go into the difficulty with
Yes.
support, to teach you how to go into it yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Be guided, having that support. Yeah. Shoulder to shoulder. Yeah. And that's what's really important. You said in terms of sometimes we're in anxious state or survival state for such a long time that we become numb to it.
Mm.
And I like to use the contrast or the differentiation or discernment, should I say, between the stress energy, the anxious energy as conscious because you're alive, but you're not consciously aware of it yet.
Mm. Mm.
And then the coach or the therapist you're with will not point it out straight away.
Yeah.
You're anxious. It's really about just coming to that edge every session, depending on how long it takes for you. Yeah,
Yeah.
just
It's a little bit
really,
like,
yeah,
yeah, for me, it's a little bit like it's somewhere in maybe in a locked cupboard, and the
mm,
coach's work is to help me approach the cupboard, recognize it's there, open it, but it's all me going towards whatever that experience or that memory or that difficulty is, and then start working with it rather than find mechanisms to close that cupboard even more. and lock it away even more so I never have to feel that discomfort, which is very much what our society seems to be driving towards.
Yeah, so numbing out happens more often.
Yeah.
Or the distractions. Yeah.
And then I guess the other, so the one piece I'm hearing is moving and just meeting it. And then
Yes.
I guess the other parts that we have done some videos on, and I'll add the links below, is maybe just the regulation practices, tuning into the physical body, getting used to just being aware of the sensory experience of yourself, whatever state you're in, as almost as a warm-up. Does that feel?
Yeah. Yeah. To know you're anxious, for one, but also two, the regulation practices help keep us in terms of what I call health maintenance.
It's like hygiene.
Yeah, hygiene almost. So you clear your system after a stressful day. And then also another practical point, once you've done those videos or you feel you've more regulated, maybe go and have that conversation with your partner and say, hey, I feel like this, and these things have been happening in our relationship. Make it more practical. Like, you're regulated now, they're more likely to be regulated. So the conversation might go
Better than you think.
better than you think. Yeah, yeah. It wouldn't be as bad, but be mindful that only when you're ready to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
We're not forcing you to do anything here, but that's a way into it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Shaun. It was a good little chat. And everyone online or wherever you are, thanks for watching. I hope this was useful. We'll drop links below and some other resources potentially. And as always, you're welcome to reach out to us for support if you need any. Have a good week.
Yeah. You too. Take care.